everyone. My name is Rewa. I'm a senior park aide in interpretation at Wilder Ranch State Park, and I'm excited to have you join me today for our next installment of Hard Day's Work on the Ranch. You find me here standing in the middle of the cultural preserve at Wilder Ranch State Park on the Central California coast, surrounded by buildings that were built in the 18 and 1900s. And if you've tuned in for some of our previous live stream broadcasts, you'll know that we have been looking through the windows of these buildings and looking back in time to explore some of the labor that was going on behind the scenes in order to keep this thriving ranch running in the 18 and 1900s. So we're going to be continuing that exploration today by taking a look at the gardens surrounding me, thinking about the crops that would have been growing here 100, 200 years ago, and taking a look at the potentially perilous practice of canning. So that's what's in store today. But as we get started and take a minute to allow more visitors to tune in, let me give you some updates about Wilder Ranch State Park right now. As you may be aware, the visitor center and the parking lot are closed at this time in order to encourage social distancing and help protect public health and safety. However, if you do decide to come out and hike or bike on the trails, please do so in a way that is safe to you and to others around you. And I encourage you to check out the California State Park website, where they've published some guidelines about how to be safe when recreating in public parks during this time of the coronavirus. And that includes washing your hands frequently, bringing soap to use in the restrooms here, and using hand sanitizer, wearing a cloth face covering when you're out in public spaces, making sure you're not in groups of larger than 10 people, staying 6 feet away from other park visitors, and finally staying home if you're sick. Those are 5 ways that you can help keep Wilder Ranch State Park a safe place to be, which enables us to keep our gates open. So thank you for paying attention to all of that. Now, as I said, I'm joining you here from Wilder Ranch State Park on the Central California coast, and right now we are in the gardens of the historic dairy ranch on the cultural preserve. And so this is a piece of land that has been protected so that these buildings here can continue to tell their stories into the future about people who've lived here in the past. But we know that the cultural history of this park extends far beyond when the Wilders first arrived here. It actually extends thousands of years earlier. And so we need to remember that the land that we're standing on right now is native land. Right now I'm standing on the ancestral homeland of the Awaswas-speaking Weepy people. And their descendants participate in contemporary Native American groups, such as the Amamutsan Tribal Band. And they continue to be involved members of our community in the Santa Cruz area and at the forefront of stewardship efforts today. So join me in taking a moment to pay respect to the elders past and present who have been stewarding this land through the generations. It is such a gift for us to get to live here, work here, and play here. And as guests, we have a responsibility to be good stewards and learn how to take care of this place too. So I want to say hello and welcome to everyone who's just joining me now. Hi, Dad from France. Glad that you were able to make it. Hi, Wendy. Everyone else who's tuning in, go ahead and tell us who you are and where you're coming from. Where are you tuning in from? You can type that into the comments. And also, go ahead and type your questions throughout the program into the comments, and I'll do my best to answer those as we go. I'm also joined digitally by our lead interpreter, Sky, who will also be typing in answers to your questions throughout the program. So, let's dive in. We're here in the Wilder Ranch Cultural Preserve, surrounded by buildings built in the mid-1800s. And today we're going to be stepping back in time 100 years ago and looking at the hard work that was going on behind the scenes in order to keep this ranch running. And specifically today we'll be looking at the gardens, the crops that were growing here 100 years ago, and the potentially hazardous practice of canning. As you can see, these gardens are in full bloom right now. They're totally blossoming and spring has really sprung here. And I want to give a shout out to our team of volunteer docents who come out here every single week to help tend these gardens. They're constantly weeding, planting new sprouts, watering, and somehow finding a way of protecting these plants from the incredible host of pocket gophers that we have living on site, and ground squirrels. Which, I have nothing against pocket gophers. They were here first. There's just plenty of other plants for them to eat besides the flowers. So shout out to our volunteers who do an incredible job tending these gorgeous gardens and keeping them flourishing. You can bet that gardening was a huge part of daily life back in the 18 and 1900s. The Wilders were master gardeners, of course, because they needed to feed a huge family. Their whole extended family, the ranch hands who we talked about last week, there were at least 15 of them, and any visiting friends and family that came to town. So they had enormous fruit and vegetable gardens here. They also had herb gardens and flower gardens that would have added spice and color to their food and to life. And D.D. Wilder himself was known to have said that in the season, any visitor that came knocking would not have left this house without a large supply of whatever was ripe. So it was important to them to be growing lots of beautiful things here to feed all of the hungry mouths around the ranch. And we actually have records of some of the things that they would have been growing about 100 years ago. So I want to show you this map right here. And it's pretty small, so you probably can't read it very well, but I'll help point out to you what's on there. This is a map that was based on records from the 1920s that show us what would have been growing in the garden here. So we have rows of peas, corn, squash, new potatoes, beets, and carrots. Some rhubarb right here, asparagus, loganberries. I see a sugar plum here and a fig tree, so lots of fruit. Also a grape arbor. We have raspberry bushes and blackberry bushes too, sweet corn and a corn crib, string beans, tomatoes. There's a lot going on, and an herb garden. And in the herb garden they would have had rosemary and lavender growing, and they would have had dill and chives. So there's a lot going on in this garden. And actually today, Wilder Ranch State Park leases out part of its land to local organic herb growers. And if you've ever walked the Old Cove Landing Trail, or even just when you drive right into the park, you would have seen some of those fields. You could see the fields of rosemary, which right now are having beautiful purple blossoms along them. And actually throughout history, Wilder Ranch has been leased out to local farmers to grow things like strawberries and Brussels sprouts and artichokes. So this land here is no stranger to growing things. Now I'm going to let you look around the garden a little bit, and then we're going to head inside. So I'll turn you around, and let's take a look at some of the beautiful things growing in this flower garden. Maybe you all recognize some of the blossoms that you see. There's a lot growing here. But next, we're going to be heading into this building right here. This is the 1859 Gothic Revival farmhouse. So as we walk over to the back door, I'll just tell you a little bit about this building. Do you mind if I go this way? Would that be possible? Thank you. All right, so this building was built in 1859 by Moses Meader and his family. But he had acquired this land from the Castro-Bolkoff family, who were the first family to start the practice of dairy ranching here back in the 1830s, back when this land here was a part of Mexico. And so from the Castro-Bolkoffs to the Meaders, eventually this land went to the Wilder family. And we had 5 generations of Wilders that lived in this building behind me until the 1960s when they sold the property. And then in the 1970s, it became a state park. And so that's why the name Wilder got carried along and became the name of the state park as well. The Wilders were known for being incredibly innovative, and they brought this ranch up to an incredibly successful state of operation that won it renown across the state of California. And so that's why we still talk about the Wilders today. So we're going to head into their farmhouse and check out the canning room. So follow me. Come on. All right, here we are on the back porch. And as you can see, it says no admittance because these buildings are closed to the public except during our public tours. But you're all right today because you're with me. All right, let's head inside. So we're here in the Wilder's kitchen. I'll let you hang out here for a second while I go close the door. Okay, so next we're going to head into the canning room. Maybe some of you have visited Wilder Ranch before and you're familiar with this room here. So we're walking into a room that is just adjacent to the kitchen, into this pantry here. And you can see a lot of really neat old tools on the wall. Sorry that the words are reading backwards. But you can see right here we have a raisin seeder and a cherry pitter. I'll just let you take a look around the canning room. And you can actually see out this window right into the gardens where we just were. Okay. So, here we are in the canning room, which maybe I don't need to tell you about this. You all have your very own purpose-built canning room in your house, right? What's that? Oh, you don't? You don't have a canning room? Okay, well, let's talk about why would a house built in the 1800s absolutely have a canning room all to itself, separate from the rest of the house? What was it doing here? And how did canning even work? And what were the potential dangers that required you to have this separate space, separate from the rest of the household, in order to do your canning? Let's find out. Now, you are probably getting very familiar with different strategies for making food last longer these days, aren't you? Because we're all trying to leave the house less often. And instead of popping over to the store every day, we're doing it maybe once a week or every 2 weeks, so we have to make our food last longer. Now, the Wilders would have been experts at this because that was the necessity of the era. Say your peach trees in the orchard, those would be blooming in the late summer, and you could go out and grab a peach, but come January, you can't head out into the orchard and grab a piece of fruit to eat. You can't even go hike over to the town of Santa Cruz and visit a grocery store and expect to find a peach that had been grown 1,000 miles away in a different country where it was still summer. No. What they were eating, really, especially when it came to produce, was grown locally. And so they had to figure out a way of capturing what was ripe in the summer and capturing it to be able to enjoy it throughout the rest of the year. So one of the main ways of doing that was through the practice of canning. Is anyone out there an expert canner? Does anyone make preserves or jams? Go ahead and give us a shout out in the comments and let us know. Maybe you have your own special tips and tricks that you can teach us. I'm not an expert at canning, but I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I know that may have applied to the Wilders back when they were canning things here on this property. So, the practice of canning really has 3 main steps that I'll talk you through. And the first step starts with a sterile jar. Kind of like this one right here. Here we have a glass ball jar. You can still get ball jars at any hardware store today. And so you'd want a sterile jar because you want to make sure that it's absolutely clean before you start to put your preserves in there. Any skilled canner would definitely have a pot of boiling water right next to them so that they could be continually dipping their glass jars and their tongs and utensils into the water to make sure that it was sterile as they went. I can see that we have some expert canners here. Daniel, your grandma was a great canner. That's awesome. And Carol. This is a practice that used to be very common, and it's kind of a skill that's losing traction now. So it's something that I want to learn how to do better so that I also have that capacity to capture the amazing parts of summer and keep them through the rest of the year. So we have our sterile jar. And step 2 is that we're going to pour in whatever it is that we want to preserve. And so maybe you've just cooked up a big pot of fresh raspberry jam, or maybe you've just sliced up some peaches and you're going to put them into your jar along with a sugary syrup, or vegetables that you want to preserve in vinegar. There's all sorts of things that you can preserve. You could do meats, stews, you could have meal in a jar, soups, sauces, preserves, all kinds of things. So you'll pour those right into your jar, filling it almost all the way to the top. And then, step 3, you'll seal it up. So you'll put on the lid, and then there's a variety of different ways that you could seal it. You'd probably put it into a water immersion bath where it would bubble and boil until you heard that pop of the lid expanding, and then you knew it was really sealed. Or you might have a pressurized canner or some other mechanism for sealing up your preserves. And then there you go. You've got your preserves ready to go. So you may be saying, all right, easy peasy, 3 easy steps, what's the big deal? Why did you need a whole separate room for it? It's not that hard. But you have to be aware there were some dangers in the canning process. Does anyone have guesses? Maybe you learned from your grandma or your grandparents or your parents who did canning what some of the dangers were. Part of the reason you had to have this separate room was because this was a potentially perilous practice. For example, one of the biggest dangers of canning was the risk of botulism. So if you didn't seal your food properly, your preserves could develop botulism, which is a bacteria that grows in improperly sealed foods. And botulism can cause paralysis and even death. And you don't necessarily see it on the food. So that was a really important one to pay attention to, and that's why people really followed those canning procedures precisely, by making sure things were sterile, really using clean new lids and sealing them properly. Carol, that's a great point. Another danger is that it's really easy to burn your hands with that boiling water, especially because you are continually putting hot glass jars in and out. So that's another reason that you had to be very careful in this practice. And the last reason why it was dangerous is because these jars were known to explode sometimes for a whole bunch of different reasons. Imagine that you have just taken your freshly sliced peaches and you've put them into the jar, sealed it up, and those peaches had air in them, right? And so the air will start over time to bubble out, and those bubbles float to the top. And then that can build up. And if enough pressure builds up under that cap, it can explode, and it does. Another way this happens is if you haven't properly sealed the jar and the food inside starts to rot and ferment and it spoils. And that's going to release all kinds of gases that can build up underneath the lid and cause another explosion. Also, sometimes the acid in the foods that you've preserved can react with the metal in the can and can cause a buildup of hydrogen gas, which again can cause an explosion. And lastly, these glass jars are known to crack when they undergo really severe changes in temperature, like when you are sealing them by putting them in boiling water and then taking them out to cool. And so you can end up with spoiled food and shards of glass all over the room if you're not careful. And those are some of the reasons that these jars were never stored in the kitchen where people were walking in and out, but were always kept in a separate space, like a storeroom or a canning room like this here. And we can see on the wall some of the beautiful, colorful things that the Wilders might have canned here. And they would have been stored here in this separate room because you never know, even the best canner, you can't know which ones of these jars might be a ticking time bomb. So better safe than sorry. But I love to look at the long, beautiful wooden shelves in this room and think about them lined with beautiful, colorful jars of foods. A whole rainbow from the Wilders' garden that they would have preserved here to enjoy all year long. So that's a little peek into the Wilder gardens and the practice of canning so that you can have a sense of what kinds of hard work were required to keep this ranch running. Because you can bet, in addition to the folks who were working in the horse stables, who were working in the cattle barn, who were churning butter in the creamery, all of that labor was required to make this ranch run, but also we needed people in the garden, sowing seeds and canning food to feed all of those workers. This work would have been just as crucial, and the ranch couldn't run without it. So, I would love to take a couple minutes to answer any questions that you all have about life on the Wilder Dairy Ranch in the 18 and 1900s, or about Wilder Ranch State Park in general. So go ahead and type in your questions into the comments. And while you're thinking, I'm going to read you a little poem right here from the Wilder Ranch State Park Cookbook, which is chock full of recipes, family recipes, gathered by some of our volunteer docents in their archival research. This was published in 2012. And in this book, we have a little poem that was shared from the docents that created it. So I will read you this poem as you think of the questions that you have. We may live without poetry, music and art. We may live without conscience, without heart. We may live without friends, we may live without books. But civilized man cannot live without cooks. He may live without books, what is knowledge but grieving? He may live without hope, what is hope but deceiving? He may live without love, what is passion but pining? But where is the man who can live without dining? Lord Lytton. All right, there you go. So let's answer some of these questions. I'm going to turn the camera around so that you can see the rest of the room. Thanks for that, Carol. So one of our other questions was, did they keep bees? It's very possible, but I don't know myself whether any of our records show that they kept bees. Daniel, that's awesome that your grandma stored jams in the basement. There we go. So that's a great place to store jars so that they wouldn't accidentally be exploding in the middle of dinner. That's a great question, Carol. Whether they would have had sugar for canning. And I don't know the answer to that one. That makes me really curious to look up where would they have been getting sugar in the mid-18 and early 1900s. What are the bags above the jars? Okay. So I know you probably couldn't read those very well because it was backwards, but here we go again. Maybe you can see them a little bit better now. Way above my head we have cornmeal and pastry flour from the Harlem Mills, 5-pound bags. Breakfast cereal from Harlem Springs, Ohio. So that's what we have going on up there. Any other questions about life at Wilder Ranch or about the state park? I'm really excited that you all were able to join all the way from New York and France and Aptos, wherever you guys are. So thank you for taking this chance to explore the buildings with me and to step back in time. It's amazing that each week we can take a little glimpse into a different kind of hard work that was happening here on the ranch. It's kind of endless. This was a really buzzing place 100 years ago. And it's fun to get to step back and imagine ourselves in the 18 and 1900s. I hope that this gave you an awesome taste of what there is going on in the park, and that you tune in with us in future weeks. Next Sunday, we'll be hosting our next live streams. In the meantime, I'm wishing all of you a really beautiful rest of your weekend. I'm Rewa, Senior Park Aide at Wilder Ranch State Park, and it's been a joy to have you. Till next time.